Hello, greetings. This is Dr. Thomas Daffern speaking to you from my Institute of Peace Studies and Global Philosophy. I'm speaking as the director of that. It was set up in 1991, actually, as a result of a lot of research and research and development I did for 2 years at the University of London, based at the Institute of Education, working with other colleagues on how we can get peace on the planet through education. So the Institute of Education is a very great institution in London, been going for a long time. It not only trains teachers, but it also thinks about education in the bigger picture. It's the most important educational institution probably in the British Empire, Commonwealth, in Canada, Australia. You know, it's the most important of them all, and has been since it was set up. It does a lot of research into what we mean by education, what we mean by studies, how we learn. It does work on the psychology of learning and so on. Anyway, my job was to create an institute that looked at all that through the lens of peace. How can we get education for peace on this planet? And I've been working on that ever since. I worked with colleagues like Dr. Tony Weaver and Jagdish Kundara and other scholars and thinkers on education in all different aspects. And now that became an autonomous institute. Such are the pressures in higher education for fund chasing and all the rest of it, that I found it easy actually to become autonomous. And I'm speaking therefore as head of that think tank, which now has an international remit. We're based in France. And I'm going to comment on the status of Britain in relation to the European project, the European Union, because I've seen it from both sides. I was brought up in Britain, in Sussex largely, although I was born in Canada. And, I know British culture. I've lived for 10 years in London. My degree was from the University of London. My PhD is from London. I taught at the University of London for many years. And then I taught at the University of Oxford, so I know Oxford very well. I've travelled all over England. I was a teacher in the English education system for 10 years, teaching religious studies and philosophy and ethics. I've also lived, however, in Wales for about 7 years and Scotland for about 7 years. So I know the UK as a whole very well. I've travelled to Ireland many times. And one of the projects my institute set up is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for Britain and Ireland. So I gave enormous thought to the question of should Britain remain in the European Union. And I was pleased in the sense that we had the referendum. I think it was run on the wrong protocols. I think that there should have been a higher, sort of safety mechanism, so that a certain percentage should have voted to change the status quo. I think that was a strategic error and an intellectual error on the part of the people that planned the referendum. I'm not sure if it was deliberate. I think it was probably a deliberate error by those that were fanatical to get Britain out of the EU. But I think that people that were more intelligent should have spotted that one and prevented that low threshold. It shouldn't be just on a small percentage point. So I'll be honest, I had to think very carefully about which way I was going to vote at the time. I was based in Scotland. And I worked it out using a calculus that I use, which is a development of my teaching as a philosopher in ethics. I've developed a system of making very complex choices mathematically. And you can then calculate in any given choice between however many options, like A, B, C, D, E, or whatever. I suppose in that case it was just 3. Vote to stay in the European Union, vote to come out, or don't vote at all. I worked it out mathematically, and it came out significantly higher on the scale to remain inside the EU for many complex reasons, which I'm not going to go into all of them here. And I'd be happy to write them up as a book someday. And I was appalled, really, that Britain voted. That let's make this clear, that a lot of England, the majority voted to come out of the EU. The people of Northern Ireland voted to stay in fact. The majority of the people of Northern Ireland voted to stay in. The majority of the people of Scotland voted to stay in the EU. a small minority in Wales voted to come out of the EU, which has now changed. All the polls show that the people of Wales have realised it was a mistake and want to stay in. And also the people of England have now largely realised it was a mistake. There's still a hard core of exit voters who will never change their minds for various ideological reasons. They haven't thought it through, and to me it's a very emotional kind of xenophobic and non-rational position. But so I'm afraid this talk probably isn't going to go down very well in anti-intellectual circles, because I think that some of the Brexit vote is coming from literally a populist anti-intellectual position, and I'm afraid I'm not comfortable with that element of the Brexit vote, which was like, let's bash the system, let's smash the elites, let's smash the intelligentsia. Some of it, yes, is legitimate, and obviously intellectuals have a duty always to explain policies, to explain the way systems work. And yes, the European Union has become very complicated, and there are aspects of it that need great reform. I'll just tell you one thing that I've been campaigning for, and I wrote to the then Prime Minister David Cameron several times proposing this when he was Prime Minister. He could have taken this forward. I said to him, at the time, this was when Greece's meltdown was happening economically, and I was looking at my Greek compatriots and feeling very sorry for them, labouring under the heavy hand of the German dominated finance ministers of Europe, and watching Varoufakis having to stand up in their meetings and then implement these austerity cuts in Greece against the instincts and will, really, of the elected Greek government, which was fairly socialist in its intention. And they're being forced by the EU to cut back on these things. And so I looked at this with horror, and I thought, this is ridiculous. These people in Brussels, these huge politicians with enormous salaries, administered by an army of bureaucrats, all on vast salaries, are imposing on this little country, which is unique in its cultural history. It's the jewel in the crown of Europe. It's where Europa first comes into cultural existence as a concept. And yet now we're forcing people to beg on the streets. So I thought there's something wrong here, and I proposed to David Cameron a very simple remedy, which is the following: that I think the European Union is staffed far too much with well-paid bureaucrats who are living the life of Riley, as we say in English. And I said to David Cameron in a private series of letters, just please, whilst you're Prime Minister, get the one thing through, which is no bureaucrat in Brussels should be paid more than the salary of the lowest paid Prime Minister in the European Union. Now, Prime Ministers don't get that vast salaries, actually. Cameron got, I don't know, 120,000 a year or something. Probably the lowest paid Prime Minister, maybe, I don't know, Romania or somewhere, would be on like 80 or 90,000, max. Now, as a democracy, I don't think it's right that bureaucrats in Brussels, civil servants, so-called, should be paid much more than, or any more, than the lowest paid Prime Minister. So there would be immediately a cut in the salary of all the Brussels civil servants who are on what we call in England a gravy train, right? And this to me would have been a great signal by the British Prime Minister that we're serious about reforming Europe, we want to stay, we love Europe, we are Europeans, but we don't like this top-heavy Brussels, top-down approach to, this new Europe that's being constructed. We want a genuine democracy of democracies, a community of nations which use common sense to order their affairs. Now, unfortunately, Cameron didn't make that speech. I believe my correspondence got through because I always got a polite reply from Cameron's office, but that was one I don't know, is it lack of courage that these politicians have? Was he afraid he'd be, ridiculed? I mean, to me it's such a logical and moral suggestion to have made at a time when absolute crisis was hitting Europe, not only in Greece but also Portugal, Italy to some extent. The differentials in wealth between the fat cats in Brussels with their fancy salaries and the average person throughout the European Union is scandalous. So anyway, that was my proposal. Didn't happen. Didn't happen. And you know, nobody else has picked up on it. Nobody said, yeah, Daffern's proposal is a very good one. Let's campaign for it. Why not? Well, I suppose the incredible capacity of people to ignore common sense and good ideas continually astounds me. You know, people seem to be able to herd in the direction of bad ideas if they appear on the internet and so on, or in the press. But good ideas, no, it's difficult. You know, it's like a fire that's damp. It's difficult to get it lit. Once it's lit, I hope it burns properly. So, and I still think that is a viable and credible proposal. Any European party should adopt that. Varoufakis is now campaigning for keeping the European Union together but making it more a democracy in which people have more say. Well, that would be a platform that his party could adopt. And I think any party in Europe who wants to keep the European Union together should adopt it. That was one thing that was ignored, right? So we moved forward to a referendum that was set up in the wrong parameters, and lo and behold, the ill-educated voters who are not given any substance to make a choice on, they're fed propaganda and lies by politicians and demagogues like Farage and co. That you know, I mean, the hypocrisy and intellectual poverty of someone like Farage. He's been a Euro MP living on a huge salary for years. I mean, he's benefited from the system that he then turns around and wants to kick in the teeth. I mean, I think MPs, Euro MPs, should be paid a reasonable salary, but they should also do their work with a good conscience. He's been, you know, he's like the chap you invite to a party who then insults the host, you know, tries to trash up the kitchen, steals the wine, and then, you know, sues you for damaging his big toe, which he stubs on the way out. I mean, Farage is a complete hypocrite, and his views should not be taken seriously by the media. It's incredible that people like him are given airtime. So where are we at? So we end up with this ridiculous referendum, and I think it's basically fiddled. The results are fiddled by a cabal that seem to have made a decision to take Britain out of the EU. What's the cabal? Well, I'm not going to go into enormous detail on that. Let's just say I'm doing my research like many other people. And I think that, let's just put it like this, that whatever cabal is behind the worst of contemporary current affairs, and I would include in that the tragedy that's happened in the Middle East, the Iraq invasion by the US and the UK, the tragedy of 9/11, which was completely non-explained by the official narrative. I'm writing a historical study of 9/11 as a historian, the first professionally trained historian to actually tackle the subject in depth. It's like a sort of PhD depth, 900 pages, and it will be out hopefully in a few months. I would say that status quo cabal, let's call it the Anglo-American elites, right, seem to think that if the UK comes out of the European Union, it will be to their advantage. Now, it will perhaps only be to the advantage of the super rich elites of the Anglo-American sphere, and we're talking about you know, the Rupert Murdoch types, the media elites, the people that own the Daily Telegraph, the Daily Mail, Viscount Rothermere, all their kind of family crew, most of whom don't live in England or the UK, in fact. They live offshore for tax purposes. And they're the super elites. Murdoch obviously lives in America. They think that they'll be able to engineer their kind of finance capitalism, cutthroat capitalism, whatever you want to call it, with more elan with the UK outside of the EU. I think that included in that cabal, you have to include the major financial sponsors of the arms trade, the military-industrial complex that Eisenhower talked about, the huge arms manufacturers in America and in Britain who are in cabal with each other. You know, the people that make nuclear weapons and the rocket systems that launch them, and all the other drones and all the rest of it. Research who that is, those companies, who are on those boards of those companies. Those are the people that really were pulling the strings behind the scenes to try and get Britain out of the EU. Why? One of the reasons is that the EU gradually and slowly is trying to become a more ethical and moral force in the world for peace. It was given the Nobel Prize for Peace because it's been trying to mediate in conflict situations like in Iran. It was the European Union foreign minister that managed to help get the agreement with Iran and the US and others when it looked like it was falling apart, which unfortunately Mr. Trump, the president, although how much longer he'll remain president following the legal shocks of the corruption that he's been involved with, as revealed by his lawyer, Michael Cohen and others, this will come out in the next few days and weeks, and I don't think Trump's going to last. He will be impeached. But it's not Trump, the figurehead, that I'm concerned with. It's the people behind Trump. It's the people behind the American presidency. That's the corporate sector. Chomsky talks about this in great detail. I think we see eye to eye on this. They're actually running the show. And they thought, in their stupidity, and I have to say it is stupidity, it would be to their advantage to engineer Brexit. I think these are the people behind data analytics who funded the research that makes Facebook and all the rest, the algorithms, turn up so that you get a phone call because they know you're a wavering voter and the guy says, look, you really should vote for Brexit. You know, this is psychological manipulation of democracy at the highest level of sophistication. But it's a scandal, you know, and shouldn't be tolerated by intelligent British citizens who should demand the right to a second referendum. That's really what is the purpose of my sharing this data with you. I'm speaking as a philosopher and intellectual why the people of Britain deserve a second referendum on fairer terms. And I think there should be a triple lock on it so that all the countries of the United Kingdom have to vote leave for us to leave. Otherwise, the UK is going to break up. You know, it's as simple as that. So another reason why the Anglo-American elites, the financial institutions and arms institutions voted for Brexit and engineered Brexit is because a lot of them are funded by Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. A lot of the wealth that the Anglo-American elites work with is actually originating in rich countries where they're super rich, like Saudi Arabia. And we're talking billions and trillions of investments are going back and forth between Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states and the US and Britain. I know, you know, because I know people that have worked in money markets and I know how this operates. And Saudi Arabia is a young nation. It's only been around since the Saudi regime conquered Mecca and Medina. After World War I, the Saudi family stayed neutral in World War I. They didn't help the Allied victory. They saw which way the wind was blowing. The tremendous work done by Lawrence of Arabia to liberate Arabia from the stranglehold of the Turks arguably was the wrong thing to have done, because the Turks were actually at a much more sophisticated intellectual level of civilization than the Wahhabi-type inspired desert tribesmen. Ibn Wahhab, who founded the Wahhabite heresy of Islam, which is what it actually is. If you talk to any genuine Islamic intellectual, and I've met many, and I've taught at the Muslim College and other institutions of higher learning in the Islamic sphere, all genuine Islamic philosophers will say the Wahhabi ideology is a heresy, because what it's arguing is that we should only tolerate a version of Islam that was around at the time of Muhammad, that is utterly like a reversal of every thought, every idea, every invention, every new philosophical insight that Muslim scholars have come up with since Muhammad is verboten. And anyone that promotes it should be killed as a heretic. You know, this is as if some Christian sect appeared and said that You know, anyone that thinks in any way or shape or form outside the time of Jesus, literally, up to the crucifixion time, is a heretic and should be killed. So all of subsequent theologians, all the theology that tried to synthesize Greek thought with Jewish, Christian ideology, are all heresies. Well, that's not a logical position, and will be opposed strenuously by all genuine Christian thinkers all over the planet, because and all genuine Muslim thinkers likewise oppose the stupidity of the Wahhabi doctrine. Ibn Wahhab was a very unpleasant man. What he used to do was participate in the active stoning of women accused of minor things, actually, you know, adultery or whatever, falling in love with someone, sharing a kiss. Is this worth stoning? Well, Ibn Wahhab thought it was. He also believed in the literal existence of the devil, and that by stoning this immoral woman, he was defeating the devil. Now, you know, I don't know what world you want to live in, but I don't want to live in a world where people like that, with that kind of ideology, are determining my country's foreign policy and buying it with corrupt money, blood money, effectively. I would rather, an utter total rethink of Britain's foreign policy. The most sophisticated state intellectually in the Middle East, in the Islamic tradition, seems to me to be not Saudi Arabia and its current cabal. And yet, the Anglo-American elite sphere of financial interests and the military, industrial elite have gone to bed with Saudi Arabia. I think that, as my book on 9/11 would reveal, that there was complicity and collusion between that Anglo-American elite and Saudi Arabia in pre-engineering the collapse of the buildings in New York. So 9/11 was a fake event. Al-Qaeda was a trigger that was tolerated because it would buy into the narrative that then allowed a launch of an all-out illegal war on Iraq. Why? Because Saddam Hussein was a populist. He was popular with the man on the street in the Middle East. He was a socialist. He was an Arab socialist. He stood for, dignity and human rights for the Palestinians. He was a strong leader, and he stood for equal rights for the poor, but also minorities in Iraq. Baha'is, Christians, all had freedom of movement, freedom of thought, and so on, under his version of Islam. His Prime Minister, Tariq Aziz, was from a Christian background. So Saddam's vision of Islam was utterly opposed to the Saudi vision, and the West colluded illegally and immorally in destroying Saddam's vision of an Arab socialist society, living at peace with its neighbours ultimately. And that is not to say one endorses and overlooks all the horrible things that Saddam had done. Of course, he was also a criminal who oppressed many people. As a philosopher of history, one doesn't have the luxury of seeing things in black and white. Unlike media soundbite artists who think in Twitter slogans. I don't think in Twitter slogans. I look into the deep, deep history of things. That's why I have a PhD in the subject. So that is some of the background you need to know about the Brexit decision. The Brexit decision was the next step in this Anglo-American elite conspiracy, which is essentially what it is. But it's a very ignorant conspiracy. And I don't think they're going to get away with it. I think the British people, the genuine intelligentsia of the world that care about Britain, that love the good things that Britain has done. I'm a Canadian British dual citizen. I love Britain. It's my country of my parents' birth and so on, and I've lived there more than any other country in the world. But I can see through its flaws. I can see its arrogance, its hubris. I have many friends in India. I've been to India many times working with non-violent specialists and people in the peace studies community. And from the Indian perspective, Britain is not, by any means a perfect nation. It committed many faults and atrocities in its long imperial history. But, on the whole, it did more good, I think, than harm. And I want to see the good that Britain has done emphasised, redoubled, and I want to see Britain's intellectual, genuinely motivated caring, compassionate nature to come forward. You know, the liberal tradition of Britain is very important to world history, and it helped, in the 19th century, we helped Italian unification, we helped liberation of Latin America, we helped progressive causes all around the world. We gave shelter to Karl Marx to come and study in London when no other country would have him. We were a haven of free thinking and liberal activity. We gave shelter to fleeing Jews from the pogroms in Russia. Britain is at heart a liberal and decent democratic society which has pioneered constitutional government. It would be a shame to see it collapse. And I think Brexit is going to hasten its collapse. And I think that some of the rich elites that have engineered Brexit honestly don't care about that. I think a lot of them are very anti-Britain, in fact. I mean, people like Murdoch and co, they actually, you know, feed off bad news because they sell more newspapers. And if Britain were to collapse and fighting break out on the streets of Ireland again, I honestly don't think they would care. I do. And so I'm passionate about this. And I've written to people that will listen. I've spoken to the Prime Minister, both in person, Theresa May, when I was in a school teaching in Wiltshire. But at that point, she was not in power. She was in the shadow cabinet. She struck me as an intelligent woman, actually. I had quite a long chat with Theresa May, and I thought, this is refreshing, a politician with a brain. Yeah, I'm not convinced. I think what's happened to Theresa May is that the burden of office has made her put her conscience, you know, out in the backyard somewhere. And I think it does it, sadly, to all politicians. Initially, I thought Tony Blair was a man of conscience. I met Tony Blair before he became Prime Minister at the funeral of John Smith, who I think was a great Labour leader and would have been a brilliant Prime Minister, and who I suspect was killed off, actually, by the same elites I'm talking about. I think they don't balk at assassination. If somebody comes along that has a brain and, you know, is intelligent enough to oppose them, I think they get assassinated. This is what the Cryptia used to do in Sparta. For those of you that are familiar with this, as a classical historian, I can inform you that in Sparta, there was a secret police, an internal intelligence agency that used to patrol the streets of Sparta. They would listen in on the cafes, the bars, in the town squares and so on. And anyone that spoke out against the government of Sparta would be found hanging from a tree, was assassinated by the Cryptia, the secret service. And I think we're almost in that kind of ball game. People that speak out tend to get assassinated by the Cryptia. Well, I'm a pro-Athenian in the conflict between Sparta and Athens. You know, I'm with Socrates and Plato and Aristotle and Pericles. When I last visited Athens, I stayed in a part of Athens where Pericles was based, the great hero of democracy. And I think we need to revive democracy. We have a debt we owe to history, that we should not go down quietly before this renaissance of the Cryptia. And that's why I'm speaking out publicly. So what I've done, and this is, I'm sharing with you something now. Again, as I say, I don't operate in secret. I'm a public intellectual. I want to make, you know, I'm willing to share with you some aspects of what I've been doing in order that you can understand and be put in the full picture and join me in the campaign for a second referendum over Brexit. The future of the entire UK is at stake here, and I'm going to explain why I think that. Right, so what I'm going to share with you is a letter I wrote to Queen Elizabeth II, current monarch of the United Kingdom. Okay, I have met her, but not to personally speak. I was at an event in Westminster Abbey once, invited for the Westminster Abbey Commonwealth Day observance, which is an interfaith observance. It's a marvellous event. I was very inspired because I'm Canadian. I love the Commonwealth. You know, I used to nurse Canadian soldiers, and that's what first got me into peace studies. In fact, was listening to the stories of these Canadian soldiers in Alberta, who'd lived through World War I. Some of them, World War II. I remember an old Scottish man, Mr. Bonthron, a Canadian Scot, who was still shell-shocked from the war, World War I, right? He said, what was that war about? Why were we there? I don't know, Thomas. He would sit on his bed in the afternoons and, like, cry and say, why were we there? He'd witnessed such horrors in the trenches and cruelty that he said, Thomas, go back to Britain and find out why we were there. There is a recent book that's come out by two Scottish historians, it's very important, which claims that World War I was started by the same Anglo-American elites that Quigley and others talk about, deliberately manufactured. That initially Germany actually didn't want World War I. It was prepared for a peace deal. The Kaiser was desperately trying to stop World War I breaking out. And the book puts forward some very interesting evidence, which I've read as a historian. It makes some mistakes, and they're not professional historians. They haven't researched it with the rigour that I would like. But they do point to some very interesting anomalies in the archives that historians should be mindful of. I think one of the most damning bits of evidence they produce is that, according to them, the Russian foreign minister was in the pay of the Anglo-American elites who were engineering for war, and was actively conspiring against the Tsar, Nicholas II, who actually wanted peace. Now that's scandalous, that's treason, right? But this Russian foreign minister, I think he was called Sazonov, according to them, can be proved to have been involved in conspiratorial, treasonous exchanges with British and French, in fact, intelligence agents, okay, who were actively bringing Russia into a declaration of war against Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire over the Bosnian assassination of the Archduke. That was a minor incident which could have been resolved diplomatically. It could have been resolved by allowing, a brief show of strength by the Austro-Hungarians. They could have captured Belgrade in a couple of days and, tried a few people and assuaged their pride, and everything would have been fine. But no, the elite wanted to blow that incident into World War I, and the way that was to happen was that Russia had to mobilise its troops, right? And that was what Sazonov, the foreign minister of Russia, and his colleagues at the war ministry and so on were doing. The Tsar said, hang on, why are we mobilising? He wanted to prevent this. Because in those days, the game was, if your country mobilises, that meant you call all the troops together, they assemble at a place near the frontier, they're all equipped and armed, their trucks and trains and everything's ready and primed. That's what mobilising means. It's like getting ready for the fight. Once you start doing that, then the enemy that you're about to attack also has to mobilise, by definition. And obviously they knew through reconnaissance planes and all the rest of it what they were doing. So Austro-Hungary and then Germany started counter-mobilising. The Tsar realised what was happening and realised, my God, we're going to be at war with these enormously important powers, and that's my cousin in charge of Germany, and why are we doing this? And at the last minute, he was in such horror of the thought of World War I breaking out, he sent a private ambassador on the train from St. Petersburg to go to Berlin with a personal message to the Kaiser saying, I don't want war, I will stand down my troops immediately. If you do, let's work this out peacefully, and this is all a big mistake. There's no way we can afford a war here. Probably our thrones won't survive. Which is, of course, what happened. Both the Kaiser and Nicholas the Tsar lost their thrones, and we entered decades of turbulence in Europe. Okay? So that's... Now, you know what happened, and this I find extraordinary, these Scottish historians have found, is that Sazonov and the Russian conspirators dragged that man off the train in St. Petersburg and locked him away. In other words, they went against the Tsar. They actually manhandled him off the train, which he was on the night express, about to leave the station any minute for Berlin. And that, if he'd have been allowed to travel, it would have stopped World War I. So they had to pull him off the train. Well, this is the stuff of movies. A movie should